It happens like this. You are asleep, or you have been, and now you are awake. You are quite sure of it, because you can feel the pillow beneath your head, and the weight of the blanket, and the shape of the room around you. And you can see the ceiling, or the window, or the door. Your eyes are open. Your mind is clear. You know, with the ordinary certainty of the ordinary morning, where you are and who you are. And you cannot move. Not a finger, not a toe, not your head. You try, and it does not happen. You try again, harder, and again, nothing. Your breath is still going in and out, slowly, more slowly than seems right. But you cannot hurry it. You cannot open your mouth. You cannot make a sound. You are, in this moment, exactly as you were a moment ago in your sleep, but you are watching it happen. And then, in almost every account of this, in almost every place it has been described in the last 1,000 years, something else begins. There is a presence in the room. You cannot see it at first. You know it is there. It is the way you know someone is standing behind you in a queue without having to look. A shift in the weight of the air. An animal awareness that has nothing to do with your eyes. Something has come in. Something is watching. Sometimes, next, you feel a weight settle onto your chest. It is heavy. It is heavier than it should be, than any weight you have ever known. You cannot draw a full breath. Beneath the weight, your ribs feel small. Your heart, which is the only thing in you that still seems to be moving freely, is beating very fast. Sometimes, next, you see it, a shape at the foot of the bed, or in the doorway, or bending over you, in the darkness or the half-light of a room you know perfectly well. There is a shape you do not recognize, a figure, indistinct, but unmistakably a figure, a person that is not a person. Sometimes it is only a silhouette. Sometimes it has features. Sometimes it wears something like a hat. And you cannot move. And you cannot cry out. And you cannot look away. The experience lasts, on average, somewhere between 20 seconds and 2 minutes. To the person having it, it feels much longer. It ends. When it ends. All at once. The paralysis breaks. You sit up in the bed. The room is empty. The heart in your chest is racing. The clock, if you look at it, says a time that is far too early to be up, and far too soon after when you fell asleep for so much to have happened. You put on a light. You get a glass of water. You wait for the shaking to stop. You do not, in most cases, tell anyone about it. Not at first. And when you do, eventually, you find that there is a word for it. The word is different in each place and each language. In the small fishing villages of Newfoundland, the outports on the eastern coast of Canada, settled by English and Irish fishermen in the 17th and 18th centuries, the word for it is the Old Hag. To have had one, in the local phrase, is to have been hagged. In the late 1970s, an American folklorist named David Hufford spent several years traveling among the outports, collecting oral accounts of what the local people believed about the hag. He listened to fishermen and their wives and their children. He recorded them, describing in the same terms again and again the same experience. The paralysis, the pressure, the presence, the figure. Hufford published his findings in 1982 in a book called The Terror That Comes in the Night. He argued in the book something that folklorists at the time found difficult to accept. He argued that the Newfoundland fishermen were not making it up. He argued that they were not describing a story they had heard from their grandparents. He argued that the fishermen, like people in dozens of other cultures around the world, in dozens of other languages, over hundreds of years, were describing a real experience that happens to a real percentage of the human population, in the same shape, whether the person having it has heard the story before or not. The name is cultural, Hufford said. The experience is not. We now know, from a body of research that has grown steadily over the last 50 years, that Hufford was right. A meta-analysis published in the journal Sleep Medicine Reviews in 2011, gathering 35 studies and more than 36,000 people from a dozen countries, arrived at a set of numbers that has been broadly confirmed since. About 7.5% of the general population, worldwide, has had at least one episode of sleep paralysis in their lifetime. Among university students, the number rises to about 28%. Among people with psychiatric conditions, particularly post-traumatic stress disorder and panic disorder, the number rises further to about 32%. It is more common in some populations than others. It is more common in people who sleep on their backs than on their sides. It is more common in the sleep-deprived and in shift workers, and in students in exam weeks, and in people going through periods of high stress. It is not, in the medical sense, a disease. It is something the healthy human brain does. Sometimes, for reasons that we now, roughly, understand. But this is not tonight's story. Tonight, before we come to the brain, we come to the names. Because for most of human history, no one had a physiological explanation. What they had was a folk word, a creature, a visitor, a weight in the dark that people in every part of the world and in every language they had tried to describe. The English word nightmare does not mean what most English speakers now think it means. It is a compound word, night and mare, but the mare is not the horse. The mare, in Old English mere, is a specific supernatural being. In the Germanic folklore, from which the word descends, the mare is a female demon who steals into the bedrooms of sleeping people at night and sits astride their chests. She is heavy. She has a particular preference for young men. She rides them, in the folk term. The exact word survives, in Norwegian, as Narrated, the mare's ride, until they wake, terrified, unable to breathe. The word is at least 1,000 years old. The Ynglinga saga, a 13th century Icelandic history, describes a Swedish king named Vanlandi being killed in his sleep by a Mare sent by a spurned witch. The Germanic peoples of the early medieval period had names for her in almost every language. The Mare in German, the Nachtmerrie in Dutch, the Cauchemar in French, from which the modern Cauchemar still means nightmare. Whatever else these people disagreed about, they agreed that a mare, a specific, feminine, chest-riding creature, was the being who came to them at night. In parts of Germany, particularly in the Alps, she has a masculine equivalent, the Alp. The Alp is an elf, or something like one. He sits on the sleeper's chest, in his invisible weight, until the sleeper wakes, gasping. The German word for nightmare, to this day, is Albtraum, the elf dream. And the specific act, the crushing weight, is called Albdruck, elf pressure. Martin Luther, in the 16th century, believed that his own mother had been afflicted by an alp sent by a neighbor woman who was a witch. In Japan, the same experience has a different name and a different origin. The Japanese word for sleep paralysis is Kanashibari, literally, bound in metal chains. Its origin is Buddhist. In the esoteric traditions of Shingon and Shugendo, there is a specific spell, Kanashibari no Ho, invoking the binding rope of Fudo-myo-o, the wrathful Buddhist deity, to immobilize an opponent or a spirit. The founder of Shugendo, a mountain ascetic named Enno Ozunu, who lived in the 7th century, was said to be able to use it to bind disobedient demons. Somewhere between the 7th century and the modern day, the same word, the binding rope of the wrathful deity, came to be used colloquially for the experience of waking in the night, unable to move. In some tellings, the Kanashibari is caused by a kitsune, a spirit fox. In some tellings, a tanuki, a raccoon dog. In some tellings, a jealous former lover. In each case, someone else is doing the binding. Someone else is in the room. In the Arabic-speaking world, the experience is very commonly attributed to the Jinn. The specific word varies by region. In Egypt, it is al-Jatham, the one that crouches upon. In some other places, it is al-Khanik, the strangler, or al-Naidalan. In Turkish, related, it is Karabasan, the black one who presses. In each case, the folk attribution is a Jinn, a spirit made of smokeless fire, older than humanity, invisible except by its own choice, that has come into the room and settled its weight on the sleeper. A study conducted in 2013 by the sleep researcher Balan Jalal, an Egyptian-Danish researcher working at Harvard, surveyed general population sleep paralysis experiences in Cairo and in Copenhagen. He found that about half of the Egyptian participants who had experienced the paralysis attributed it, quite directly, to a Jinn. In Denmark, none of the participants did. The Egyptian participants also had, on average, longer episodes, more frequent episodes, and greater fear. Jalal's careful conclusion was that the same underlying biological event, filtered through different cultural interpretations, produced measurably different clinical burdens. The physiology, in other words, is universal. The story you have been told about the physiology is not. We could go on, at length. There is the Batibat of the Ilocano people, in the northern Philippines, an obese female spirit who lives in trees and follows the timber into people's houses and suffocates them at night if they sleep beside a post carved from her tree. There is the pisadeira of the Brazilian countryside, a thin old woman with red, bulging eyes and long, dirty nails, who crouches on the chest of those who have eaten a heavy meal and lain down on their backs. There is the Popobawa of Zanzibar, an island off the coast of Tanzania, a bat-winged shadow of recent tradition that has caused several waves of genuine mass panic in the years 1965, 1970, 1995, and 2007. In some of those years, mobs on the island beat to death mentally ill strangers whom they suspected of being the Popobawa in human form. The most careful ethnographic work on the Popobawa, by the British anthropologist Martin Walsh, who was living on Pemba during the 1995 outbreak, argues that the panics correlate closely with the island's election years. There is the Old Hag of the Gullah communities of the Georgia and South Carolina coast, a red, skinless witch figure who sheds her skin at night and enters through a crack under the door and rides the sleeper, drawing not blood, but breath, The traditional protection in the Gula communities is a broom by the bed. The Old Hag, according to tradition, must stop and count every straw in it and cannot finish before dawn. There is the dabbed sog of the Hmong, a crushing spirit, to which, in the 1970s and 80s, an anthropologist named Shelley Adler attributed, in part, one of the most disturbing epidemiological stories of the 20th century, to which we will return. If we ask, from all of this, what the definitive visual image of the experience is, we come, probably, to a single painting. In 1781, a Swiss-born English painter named Henry Fuseli, trained in Rome in his early 40s, and by his own admission romantically obsessed with a young woman named Anna Landolt, who had rejected him, completed an oil painting for the Royal Academy in London. It is a small painting, roughly a metre wide. It shows a young woman in a white nightgown, apparently asleep, her head and one arm draped over the edge of a bed, her body angled toward the viewer. On her chest, crouching, is a small ape-like creature, an incubus. Its back is hunched. Its eyes look directly out of the picture at us. And behind the bed, peering through a parted curtain, is the head of a wild-eyed horse, the Mare, drawn as the animal, in a visual pun. The painting is called The Nightmare. When it was exhibited in London in 1782, it caused a small sensation. The Royal Academy that year received an unusual 12,000 extra visitors. Fuseli painted several versions of it over the following decade. It became, and has remained, the single most recognizable European image of the experience. The incubus on the chest, and the terrified sleeper, and the room half dark behind them. The Nightmare now hangs at the Detroit Institute of Arts. There is a footnote here worth pausing on. The medical profession of the 18th century did not mostly take sleep paralysis seriously as a distinct phenomenon. That did not begin until 1876, when an American neurologist named Silas Weir Mitchell of Philadelphia, a physician of some standing who had made his name on the treatment of nerve injuries during the American Civil War, published a short clinical description of what he called night palsy. The subject awakes to consciousness of his environment, Mitchell wrote, but is incapable of moving a muscle, lying to all appearance still asleep. He is really engaged in a struggle for movement, fraught with acute mental distress. Could he but manage to stir, the spell would vanish instantly. That is, almost word for word, what Newfoundland fishermen would tell David Hufford in the 1970s. It is, almost word for word, what a graduate student in Cairo would tell Balan Jalal in 2012. It is, roughly, what someone lying awake tonight, in New York, in Tokyo, in Lagos, in Reykjavik, would tell you tomorrow morning if they could bring themselves to. The physiology, when it was finally understood, turned out to be almost as strange as the folklore. To hold the shape of it, you have to know something about REM sleep. REM stands for rapid eye movement, and it is one of the two main kinds of sleep the human brain does. In the course of a night, you cycle through both. Quiet, slow-wave sleep, in which the body repairs itself and the memory consolidates. And REM sleep, in which the eyes flicker beneath their lids. The electrical rhythms of the brain approach those of waking. And dreams, the vivid, narrative, sometimes ridiculous, sometimes beautiful, sometimes disturbing dreams we remember, happen. In an average night, a healthy adult goes through 4 or 5 REM cycles, each longer than the last, with the final one, the one before waking, sometimes lasting an hour or more. During REM sleep, the human body does something extraordinary. It paralyzes itself. At the base of the brain, in a small region of the pons called the sublaterodorsal nucleus, and in the ventromedial medulla just below it, groups of neurons fire, sending inhibitory signals down the spinal cord to the motor neurons that would ordinarily move the muscles of the limbs and the face and the trunk. They release 2 neurotransmitters, glycine and gamma-aminobutyric acid, called GABA, which shut those motor neurons down. The eyes still move, because the muscles of the eye are controlled by a different pathway. The diaphragm still moves, because breathing is controlled by a different pathway. Everything else is silent. The purpose of this paralysis, as best we can tell, is to prevent us from acting out our dreams. It is, in a sense, a piece of built-in safety equipment. Without it, we would kick, we would punch, we would try to run, we would attempt to fly. With it, we lie perfectly still and dream. Sleep paralysis, as a physiological event, is what happens when this REM paralysis, this atonia, becomes dissociated from REM sleep itself. In a small number of cases, at the boundary between sleeping and waking, the paralysis remains switched on, while consciousness switches on. The body is still, as it should be during REM sleep, held in its full inhibition. The eyes are open. The brain is aware of the room. But the switches that would ordinarily wake the muscles have not yet been thrown. This is, in the strict clinical sense, all that sleep paralysis is: a momentary uncoupling, a boundary event in a system whose boundaries are normally very reliable. That is not, of course, all that it feels like, because along with the persistence of atonia into wakefulness, most people experiencing sleep paralysis also experience hallucinations. Not dreams, hallucinations, perceptions of the room they are in, of things that are not in it, that feel as real to them as anything they have ever seen. The most systematic account of these hallucinations was published in 1999 by a Canadian psychologist named Alan Cheney, working at the University of Waterloo, in a paper called Hypnopompic and Hypnagogic Hallucinations During Sleep Paralysis. Cheney and his colleagues took thousands of first-person accounts, ran a statistical analysis on the specific features described, and found that the hallucinations, across cultures and across individuals, cluster into 3 orthogonal groups. The first cluster he called intruder. It is the sensed presence, the feeling that someone is in the room, together with visual and auditory hallucinations, most often of an ambiguously humanoid shape, and of humming, buzzing, whispering, or footsteps. Cheney argued that this cluster arises from a hyperactive threat detection system in the midbrain, the amygdala and its associated circuits, firing at a low input threshold, and the brain then constructing a plausible source for that alarm signal. The second cluster he called incubus. It is the pressure on the chest, the sense of being crushed, the difficulty in breathing, and in some cases, a sensation of assault. Cheney argued that this cluster arises from the sleeper's perception of their own paralyzed diaphragm, shallow, slow, and unresponsive to the will, misinterpreted at the moment of terror as external suffocation. The third cluster he called vestibular motor. It is the sense of floating, of flying, of falling, of leaving the body. It is, unusually, sometimes described as blissful rather than terrifying. It arises, Cheney suggested, from a conflict between endogenous vestibular activity in the inner ear, which is still firing, and the total absence of proprioceptive feedback from the paralyzed body. 3 clusters, all present in various combinations in the different folk traditions. The Newfoundland Old Hag is a strong intruder plus incubus. The Japanese Kanashibari is a pure intruder. Certain out-of-body experiences in the meditation literature are a pure vestibular motor. There is a separate question, which the last 20 years of neuroscience have been trying to answer, which is, why does the sensed presence take the specific shape that it does? The best current answer involves a region of the brain called the right temporoparietal junction, a small area of cortex where the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe meet, roughly above and behind the right ear. The right temporoparietal junction, in a healthy, waking person, does something extraordinary. It maintains, moment to moment, the sense that we are the person located inside our own body, looking out. If this region is temporarily disrupted by a lesion, by direct electrical stimulation, by some drugs, by extreme fatigue, the sense of being inside one's own body starts to slip. In laboratory settings, patients under such stimulation sometimes report feeling that a second version of themselves is standing behind them, or beside them, or, in some cases, above them. This is called the sensed presence effect, and it has been carefully mapped in neurosurgical and stimulation studies. The current best guess model, proposed most fully by Balan Jalal and the neuroscientist V.S. Ramachandran in a paper in Medical Hypotheses in 2014, is that the shadow figure of sleep paralysis is, in effect, an externalized version of the sleeper's own body schema. It is you, projected outward in the darkness by a temporoparietal junction that is misfiring in the atonic haze. The reason it stands at the foot of the bed, or in the doorway, is that the doorway and the foot of the bed are where an unfamiliar person, arriving at night, might reasonably be. The reason it is menacing is that the amygdala is firing at high alert, and the brain constructs the most plausible source of the alarm. The shadow at the door is not, in this model, a supernatural visitor. It is you. There is, finally, the question of treatment. Sleep paralysis is not, in the medical sense, a serious condition. It is not fatal. It does not cause organic damage. In most people who ever experience it, it happens once or twice in a lifetime and is never seen again. For those in whom it recurs, the standard advice, established by Brian Sharpless and colleagues at Washington State in the 2010s, and by Balan Jalal in his work at Cambridge and Harvard, is straightforward and mostly about the boring virtues. Sleep on your side, not your back. Get a consistent 7 to 8 hours a night. Address stress before bed. Avoid alcohol close to sleep. Reduce screen exposure. For those with frequent episodes, a technique called meditation relaxation therapy, in which the sleeper, during the episode itself, reappraises what is happening as benign, focuses attention on a positive internal image, and consciously does not fight the paralysis, has been shown in pilot studies to significantly reduce both the frequency and the distress of the experience. If you are ever hagged, in other words, if the old hag ever comes to you, the 2 most useful things you can know are that you are not being visited, and that the thing that has come to visit you is you. and that it will pass, and that you can wait it out. Everything I have just said is broadly accepted in the field as our best current understanding of what is happening, and most of it, for most people, is enough. But there are, at the edges of the story, some things that do not quite fit, some patterns that the physiology, in its current shape, does not fully explain. It is worth spending a few minutes with them, quietly, before we sleep. The first is the sheer specificity of the cross-cultural convergence. If sleep paralysis were only a neurological event, the paralysis, the racing amygdala, the misfiring temporoparietal junction, you would expect the hallucinations to be, if anything, a rather generic kind of terror. Fear, yes. A sense that something is wrong, yes. Perhaps some vivid but unfocused imagery. But you would not necessarily expect people in Zanzibar, in Newfoundland, in rural Brazil, in the northern Philippines, in Kyoto, in Ilorin, in Reykjavik, to independently report the same very specific things. But they do. The pressure is always on the chest. The presence is always humanoid. The figure is often in the doorway. The sound is often a humming or a buzzing. The temperature often drops. And in a certain percentage of cases, the figure wears something like a hat. The Hat Man, as a group of American internet forums and one PBS documentary and a growing academic literature have come to call it, is a modern iteration of a very old figure. A tall, dark, indistinct man, sometimes with a wide-brimmed hat, standing at the foot of the bed or in the doorway. He appears, in the reports of people who have never spoken to one another and never read one another's accounts, again and again, in the same shape. Sometimes he is described as a fedora, sometimes as a cowl, sometimes just as a tall, thin, angular darkness. David Hufford, back in Newfoundland in the 1970s, called this the stable core of the experience. He argued, gently but firmly, that the shape of what people see in sleep paralysis is more consistent than a purely cultural model would predict. He was not arguing that anything supernatural was happening. He was arguing that whatever the brain is doing in that state produces, in the vast majority of people, the same content, and that this content has been given many different names, in many different languages, but has always been essentially the same. The Hat Man is the Old Hag, is the Alpi, is the Jatham, is the Popobawa, is the Pisadera, is the Kanashibari. What kind of brain, one is entitled to ask, produces this figure? And why is he, she, it, so remarkably the same? The second thing that does not quite fit is the story of the American alien abduction wave. Beginning in the mid-1960s and rising to a peak in the late 1980s, a very large number of people in the United States began to report, in unusually consistent terms, that they had been abducted from their beds by non-human beings. The details were remarkably stable across the accounts. The subject would wake in the middle of the night, unable to move. They would see figures in the room. The figures would come to the bed. They would experience a sense of floating, of being lifted, of being transported. They would remember, or fail to remember, various kinds of examination. They would eventually wake in their beds, unable to account for the missing time. Some of them would spend years reconstructing the memory in hypnotherapy and would come to believe sincerely that they had been abducted, physically, by beings from another world. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, two psychologists at Harvard, Susan Clancy and Richard McNally, investigated the phenomenon systematically. They recruited a large group of self-reported abductees. They gave them a battery of psychological tests. They found, first, that the abductees were not measurably more mentally ill than the general population. Second, that they scored significantly higher on standard measures of fantasy proneness, absorption, and susceptibility to false memories. Third, this was the most striking finding, that when the abductees were asked to describe their experience while being monitored, their physiological responses to the abduction script were identical to those of trauma survivors describing genuine trauma. They were not lying. Their bodies remembered something. Clancy and McNally proposed a model: sleep paralysis, plus hypnopompic hallucinations, plus a cultural template already circulating. The alien abduction narrative that first entered American public consciousness with the Betty and Barney Hill case in 1961, then Whitley Strieber's Communion in 1987, then 100 films and television programs, plus, often, subsequent hypnotherapy that helped reconstruct the memory in more coherent form. The mechanism was, at every step, biological and psychological. The content, the small grey beings, the examination table, the medical procedure, was cultural, and the physiological trauma imprint was real. This is not, to be clear, an explanation of what caused the modern UFO phenomenon. That is a larger and more complicated question, and I do not know the answer to it. But it is a plausible account of why so many otherwise ordinary Americans, in the specific decades in question, told the specific story that they told. And it is one of the clearer cases in modern psychology of a physiological substrate being poured into a cultural mold and hardening and being believed. The third thing that does not quite fit is the story of the Hmong deaths. Between the years 1977 and 1988 in the United States, a very unusual epidemiological pattern was observed among the Hmong refugees who had come to America after the fall of Laos in the Vietnam War. Somewhere between 100 and 150 Hmong men, almost all of them young, almost all of them physically healthy, almost all of them in their 30s, died, without warning and without apparent cause, in their sleep. The condition became known, in the American medical literature, as sudden unexpected nocturnal death syndrome. Similar phenomena, under different names, had been observed in Southeast Asian populations for decades. In the Philippines, Bangungot; in Thailand, Lai Tai; in Japan, Pokuri. In each case, young, healthy men dying suddenly in their sleep. Autopsies eventually revealed that many of the decedents shared a genetic predisposition to a rare cardiac ion channel abnormality, a variant of what is now called Brugada syndrome, which, under certain conditions, can produce a fatal arrhythmia during sleep. But the American medical anthropologist Shelley Adler, who studied the Hmong cases in detail over the following 2 decades, argued that the genetic substrate alone did not explain the timing. The men had not died before the resettlement. They had died in the years immediately after. They were the ones most disconnected, in that period, from the ritual practitioners, the Tiviks Neeb, the shaman healers, who had traditionally protected the Hmong community from the Dabtsog, the crushing spirit. Adler argued that a genuine and terrifying folk belief in the Dabtsog, combined with a real biological vulnerability, combined with the loss of the cultural protective apparatus in the disruption of resettlement, produced, in a small number of men, a fatal cardiac event. If Adler is right, the Dabzog was, in a strict sense, real. Not as a supernatural entity, but as a nocebo, a belief so held in a body so prepared that it could kill. Adler's thesis is not fully accepted. It is, in principle, difficult to prove, but it is a warning in the study of sleep paralysis against the assumption that the story we tell about the physiology can be entirely separated from the physiology itself. In some people, in some cultures, in some moments, the story matters. The fourth thing that does not quite fit, I will mention it briefly, is that a small minority of people who experience sleep paralysis do not at all find it terrifying. They describe it as visionary. They describe it as spiritual. They describe it as one of the most meaningful experiences of their lives. Often these are people who have grown up in traditions, Buddhist, Sufi, some Christian, various forms of contemporary spiritual practice, where altered states of consciousness are welcomed rather than feared. They enter the paralysis with a different cognitive frame, and the brain, apparently, cooperates. Some lucid dreaming practitioners deliberately induce sleep paralysis as a gateway into the dream state. They report, having done so, that the shadow figure sometimes still comes, but that they say hello and it goes away. The physiology in these people is the same. The story is different. The experience, therefore, is different. Whether that is a mystery of the brain or a mystery of the mind, or more plausibly, the same mystery seen from two directions, is not something the current science can quite settle. Before we end tonight, it is worth spending a few minutes with the other neighbors of sleep, because sleep paralysis is not the only strange thing that the brain does in the quiet minutes between sleeping and waking. It is only the most memorable. There is a phenomenon called hypnagogic hallucinations. These are the sensory images that arrive at the moment of sleep onset, the falling into sleep, rather than the coming out of it. Almost everyone has them, if they pay attention. Faces, patterns, fragments of speech, half-formed scenes. They tend to last only a few seconds, and to be gone by morning. The 19th century French sleep researcher, Alfred Maury, who coined the word hypnagogique in 1848, catalogued more than 1,800 of his own, meticulously, in a notebook by his bed, over the course of his adult life. If you have ever, after a long day of a particular task, fallen into sleep and seen fragments of that task looping through your closing thoughts, the moves of a chess game, the shape of a spreadsheet, the pieces of a Tetris board, you have had a hypnagogic hallucination. The specific version of it, falling asleep to the residue of a video game, has been given its own name in the sleep literature. It is called the Tetris effect. There is a phenomenon called exploding head syndrome. Despite the name, it is not painful, and it is not dangerous. What it is this. At the moment of falling asleep, or at the moment of waking, a person hears, inside their own head, a very loud sound, a crash, a gunshot, a slammed door, a crack of thunder. It lasts less than a second. It is startling. It has no external cause. It does not, contrary to what the name suggests, involve the head exploding or any physical event of any kind. The best current understanding is that a small failure of the brainstem's normal downregulation at the sleep-wake border produces a brief uncoordinated burst of neuronal firing in the auditory cortex. It is completely benign. And, according to a 2015 survey by the sleep researcher Brian Sharpless, about 1 in 6 university students has experienced it at least once. There is a phenomenon called false awakening. It is exactly what it sounds like. You dream that you have woken up. In the dream, you are in your own room, at your own time. You get out of bed. You get dressed. You perhaps go to the kitchen. And then, at some point, you notice something wrong. The light is strange. The room is subtly different. The clock reads an impossible number. And you realize that you are still asleep. In the strangest cases, the false awakening is recursive. You wake, in the dream, from a false awakening, and find yourself in another false awakening, and then another, nested inside itself, like a set of Russian dolls. There is a phenomenon called lucid dreaming. It is the awareness from within a dream that one is dreaming. It has been reported for centuries. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition has an elaborate practice around it, but was first objectively verified in a laboratory in 1980 by a young Stanford researcher named Stephen LaBerge. LaBerge trained himself to become lucid inside his own REM sleep, and then, once lucid, to move his eyes in a pre-agreed pattern, left, right, held for a beat, that the electrodes on his face would record. He did this. It was recorded. It was, in a sense, the first message ever sent, in real time, from inside a dream. LaBerge's work turned lucid dreaming from a folkloric report into an experimental phenomenon. There is the phenomenon of hypnic jerks, the small, involuntary muscle spasm, sometimes accompanied by a sense of falling, that many people experience as they are just drifting off. Perfectly common. About 60% of the population reports having had one. And there is, finally, one adjacent phenomenon which does not happen in bed. It happens in some of the most extreme circumstances of the human life. It is called the third man factor, and it is worth ending with tonight. In 1916, the Anglo-Irish polar explorer Ernest Shackleton, along with 2 of his men, Frank Worsley and Tom Crean, completed one of the most improbable feats of endurance in the history of exploration. Having been marooned for months on Elephant Island in the Antarctic, following the loss of their ship Endurance, Shackleton and a small crew had sailed a lifeboat 800 miles across the Southern Ocean to the whaling stations on the north coast of South Georgia. On arrival, they discovered that the whaling stations were on the other side of the island, so they set off on foot. 3 men, starving, exhausted, poorly equipped, crossing 36 miles of unmapped glacier and mountain in the winter of the Southern Hemisphere, with almost no rest. Some months later, writing his account of the crossing in his book, South, Shackleton wrote a single unusual sentence. I know that during that long and racking march of 36 hours over the unnamed mountains and glaciers, it seemed to me often that we were 4, not 3. He said no more, in the book, about it. But when Worsley and Crean were asked later about the crossing, they said the same. They had felt, each of them, all the way across South Georgia, that there had been a 4th person walking with them, a benign, silent, unseen companion. The neurobiology of the third man factor is now, roughly, understood. It is the same temporoparietal junction that in sleep paralysis produces the shadow at the foot of the bed. In extreme conditions, cold, hunger, exhaustion, hypoxia, isolation, The brain's mechanism for maintaining the coherence of the bodily self begins to slip. In some people, in some moments, it slips in a helpful direction. It generates, out of the exhausted materials of the self, a companion. The Canadian journalist John Geiger, in his 2009 book, The Third Man Factor, gathered dozens of such accounts from mountaineers, from long-distance sailors, from prisoners of war, from survivors of the World Trade Center collapse. In every case, the extra presence was benevolent. In some cases, it saved the survivor's life, telling them to keep moving, to take shelter, to hold on. It is, in a sense, the mirror image of the shadow at the door, the same neurological mechanism, the same externalization of the body schema. But when the brain is drawing on desperation rather than fear, it produces, apparently, someone we would like to be there. If you have ever been hagged, if the old hag has ever come to visit you in the dark and pressed her weight upon your chest and made herself known in her many names, then this, more or less, is what you now know. The paralysis is your own. The presence is your own. The figure at the door, in the darkness, the shape that has terrified sleepers on every continent, in every century, for as long as we have had language to name it, is a projection of your own body, made unfamiliar to you by the strangest possible failure of a system that is, most nights, exactingly reliable. It will pass. It has always passed. It has always been more common than the people it happens to imagined it was. And when it happens to you, or more likely, if it never has, when you hear another person, some evening, describe it, you will know that they are describing something real. Not the presence in the room. That was a story their brain was telling itself. But the terror, the paralysis, the moment of being awake, and still, and not alone. That much has been real for every human being who has ever had it, and the number of them, now that we have learned to count, is far larger than we thought. You are unlikely tonight to be hagged. It happens rarely, in any given night, to any given person, and in the great population of things the brain does in the night, this one is rare. But if it ever does come, for you, or for someone you love, you know now what it is. It is not a visitor. It is you, passing for a moment through a door in yourself, and then, in a minute or two, on your side, or on your back, in the ordinary dark of an ordinary room, you sleep.